There are three main languages for web development. You have HTML and CSS for your foreground, and you have one primary language for your background. This language controls what happens when the user interacts with your site. There are a few language choices for your background: PHP, JavaScript, Java, Python. I'm not going to go into detail about all of these languages, just understand that PHP and JavaScript are the primary programming languages of the web. There are three main languages for your Chrome extension development. You have HTML and CSS for your foreground, and you have one primary language for your background. JavaScript is the default language. You can use Python or Java, but those aren't official. You have to get third-party libraries to translate those languages into JavaScript. This course will use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. With that, since I mentioned those languages, let's discuss HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and it's a scripting language where we use things called tags to create HTML elements. These elements are a lot of the things you see on screen, everything from text and tables to images and links. Elements are opened and closed in two ways. Some have an open and closed tag, like an H1 tag. Some tags are self-closing, like an image tag. HTML elements also have attributes attached to them. Our image tag, for example, has a source attribute that points to the actual image file location. When we write HTML, we usually write it in a file called index.html. The most basic structure of this file is this. Doc type is a declaration of the type of file we're creating. Opening and closing HTML element tags where we put all of our HTML code. The head is where we put the code that should be loaded before the page even displays, things like JavaScript code libraries. And the body is where we put the code that generates what we actually see. HTML is executed line by line. So we have the title element there, which sets the title of the page in the browser bar. We have a style element that allows us to change the look and size and layout of our elements. Right now we're setting our body element to a background color of blue, the header 1 element to a text color of white, and resizing our image to 400 by 400 pixels. We do this by taking the elements tag and inserting some style code. That style code is CSS. Let's get into CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. It's a language that allows us to style elements of our HTML. We can style multiple elements at a time, en masse or in bulk, by just including the general HTML tag. If we add one more header 1 element to our page, all of them will have a white text color. We can also style one element or groups of elements at a time by capturing references to those specific elements using things called classes and IDs. So if we add a unique ID to one of our header elements and capture that element in our CSS code using the hashtag, we can specify style properties for that one single element. We could also use classes for this, but remember this, IDs are unique. You can only use one ID per element. Classes are not unique. You can attach one class to multiple elements and basically style those elements as a group. So if we have 3 header 1 elements on our page now and attach a class to just 2 of those header 1s, our style will only apply to those 2 header 1 elements. If the HTML is usually written in a file called index.html, where does the CSS go? Well, there are 3 ways of including CSS into our HTML. Inline, using the style attribute of an HTML element. Internal, using the style element tag. And external, creating a separate styles.css. You can name that file whatever you want. It just has to have the extension CSS. We create that file and we link it with the link element. So these are the very basics of HTML and CSS. There's a lot more that can be said on the topic, but this high-level understanding will be enough for what we need going forward. Just understand this, that with HTML, we create the bare bones of a web page for our users to see. And with CSS, we can make the web page more visually appealing. JavaScript is a high-level programming language primarily used for web development. Web development being the complete process of planning, developing, and deploying a piece of software to be used through the internet. In the old days, how web pages behaved was different. You would navigate to a web page and have a certain type of experience, something more static, less personal. You then fire up an app on your PC, Photoshop, and Trello, a video game, and you'd have a different experience, something more feature-rich, more customizable, more responsive. Nowadays, these two domains blend, the web page and the app. The experience you have with a business's app should be similar to or exactly the same as the experience you have with that business's web page. So the experience you have using the YouTube app on mobile is just about the same as the experience you have on the YouTube website. JavaScript has evolved to provide this level of interactivity between the user and the web pages. JavaScript allows websites to behave like apps. Feature-rich, personal, vibrant, responsive. JavaScript programs, like all programming languages, gets compiled or interpreted. JavaScript used to get exclusively interpreted. Interpreted means going line by line, translating the code into machine code, then executing or running it. Because of this line-by-line process, interpreters allow for better error bug checking. Compiled means taking the entire program you've written, translating all of the code into machine code, then executing or running it. Because all of the code is translated first, compiled code runs faster than interpreted code. And so JavaScript gets both interpreted and compiled. This process is called JIT, just-in-time compilation, where instead of all of the code getting compiled before execution, which is what a compiler does, the code is compiled as is needed. When our script is ready to run, what does the running? What manages the JIT decisions? What should happen if there is an error on a line in our code? What manages all of this? A JavaScript engine is the answer. There are many different implementations of the JavaScript engine, but they all basically do the same thing. They check our code for errors, optimize code using compilers, manage memory, decide when and what code should be executed. JavaScript engines exist in your web browser. Chrome has V8, Safari JavaScript Core, Mozilla SpiderMonkey, Edge Chakra. And so once you've written your program using the language JavaScript, your browser executes and manages your script. We'll discuss where to write this code and how to get your browser executing it in the next video. There are 3 places to write your JavaScript program and have it executed. 2 of those places are permanent. 1 is temporary. Let's start with the temporary place. REPL stands for Read, Evaluate, Print, Loop. It's a programming language shell. Think of it like your command prompt in Windows or your bash in Unix and Mac. It allows us to write and execute code in real time without needing to create a unique JavaScript file ourselves. The REPL shell reads the code, executes it, prints out a response, and then loops this behavior. This is what the REPL is, a place to write quick and dirty code. All of the code you write here disappears once you close your web browser. Code we write is in plain text, line by line, with proper conventions like semicolons, parentheses, and brackets. So open up your Chrome browser and press Ctrl-Shift-J if you're on Windows, or Command-Option-J if you're on Mac. This is the developer console. This is Chrome's REPL using the V8 JavaScript engine. The developer console gives us access to developer tools, mainly a REPL and real-time debugger. Let's write some code. A simple line of code that uses a method called log to print out a string to our developer console. We'll get to methods in the next video. When I hit enter, our REPL is going to read the line of code I just wrote, evaluate it, basically do what I'm telling the engine to do, print out a response, and wait for me to write another line of code. We can write multiple lines before submitting our code for execution by hitting Shift-Enter instead of just Enter. I have 2 variables here. A variable is a piece of data created by you. Variables have data types. There are many data types, from numbers and strings to data structures like objects and arrays. We'll tackle these concepts as we work our way through this course. There are 2 categories of variables in JavaScript, mutable and immutable. If you want to declare a piece of data and you don't want it modified after it's declared, use the const keyword. If you want to declare a piece of data and you want to modify it throughout the program, use the let keyword. And so I have 2 variables of type number, with names my number and my other number, and values 5 and 8. One is mutable, the other isn't. We can modify my other number whenever we want. We get an error if we try to modify the my number variable. Before we move on to the next video discussing JavaScript objects, functions, and methods, let's take the code we just wrote out of the REPL and into 2 other places, permanent places. We'll start with internal. Just like we have internal CSS using the style tag, we can have internal JavaScript using the script tag. And just like we have external CSS using the link tag to point to a standalone CSS file, we can have external JavaScript using the script tag, the source attribute pointing to a standalone JavaScript file. And so these are the three main ways of writing and executing JavaScript. The REPL is only really used for quick JavaScript you want to test. We'll be focusing on the internal and external approaches for large coding going forward. To understand what a method is, we need to understand what an object and what a function is. We'll start with a function. The idea of a function in programming comes from the idea of a function in mathematics, the f of x. You have some independent variable x, you do something to that variable, and spit out a dependent variable, f of x or y. In programming, we use the same paradigm. We write functions that take independent variables or inputs, perform logical operations on those inputs, then return an output. To write a function in JavaScript, we use the keyword function, followed by the function name, followed by parentheses or parameter listing, followed by opening and closing curly braces. Inside is where we write our logical operations. We have a function that takes a variable of type string as an argument, and inside calls the console log method and tells that method to display the input on the screen. The function also returns as the output the f of x or y, the string I got your message. To call the function we just wrote, we type the name of the function plus the parentheses in an argument. We can also have functions with multiple arguments. Here we have a function taking two arguments, two numbers. Inside the function, we create a new variable equated to the sum of the two arguments, the two inputs, then return the sum. To capture the output of the function, we just create a new variable and equate it to the function call. Now that we know what a function is and the basics of how they work, let's talk about JavaScript objects. We're not going to go into too much detail on this subject. That would require a couple more videos, and that isn't needed for this course. The basics of JavaScript objects are this. An object is a way of organizing information that uses pairings to keep track of data. A piece of data, the value, is paired with an identifier, a key or property. The keys must be strings, they can't start with numbers or special characters, and the values can be any JavaScript data type, numbers, strings, arrays, booleans, other objects, even functions. This brings us to methods. A method is simply a function that is attached to an object. When we wrote the display message function earlier, it was a standalone function. If we had written it like this, and called the function like this, display message is still a function, but talk is now considered a method of toolkit. That's the major difference between a function and a method. We have an object toolkit with a key or property talk, which has a value of function. Talk is now a method of toolkit, and talk is defined as a function. That was a lot to take in, but these are the JavaScript basics we'll need for moving forward in this course. And before we leave this section, let me mention this. There are these things in JavaScript called arrow functions. The details of these functions are outside the scope of this course. Just understand that we write arrow functions like this. The parentheses are where you define the parameters of the function, followed by the arrow and the opening and closing curly braces. We'll be using these throughout the course. Think of them simply as another way of writing a traditional function. And so I'll be explaining other JavaScript concepts as we encounter them through the course. Web development intro out of the way. In this course, I will be doing my best to explain every line of code, where it comes from, and what exactly we're trying to achieve with it. We'll go through the basic components of a Chrome extension, how they all fit together, your Chrome extension development environment. Then we'll build two projects with multiple phases together, each one designed to ingrain new skills into you, while building off of the previous skills learned. We'll build an extension that allows the user to rank and comment the current web page they're viewing. They'll rank 1 to 5, and we'll give them a chance to leave some feedback. Then we'll finish with a more robust extension. When the user is watching a YouTube video, they'll have the opportunity to see and interact with a list of recent uploads from that YouTube creator. Before we get into any of that, though, We need to know and understand how a Chrome extension works. Let's begin.